The village sat quietly between yesterday and tomorrow, like a child unsure which path to follow. On one side were mud brick houses shaped by hand and memory, their walls carrying the stories of ancestors. On the other side stood unfinished concrete buildings, rising slowly like broken promises of a modern future. Elders still gathered beneath the old mango tree, their voices heavy with wisdom, while young men spoke excitedly of cities where money moved faster than time. In this village, tradition was not dead, but it was tired of competing with new dreams. Dust roads wound through the homes like veins, carrying footsteps, secrets, and rumors. Every morning, women gathered at the communal well, lowering buckets while exchanging glances and quiet words. By evening, drums spoke to the sky, calling people home as the sun bled into the earth. The wind itself seemed to carry gossip, lifting whispers from one compound to another. In this place, truth walked slowly, but rumors ran barefoot and fast. No one lived alone here, every action was watched, weighed, and remembered. Among the men of the village was one whose hands were known for work and whose back knew no rest. From sunrise to sunset, he labored, earning respect with sweat rather than words. Neighbors greeted him with nods of approval. "That man," they said, "he provides." Yet inside him, peace did not live. When night came, his thoughts refused to sleep. He measured himself against other men, fearing laughter more than hunger. Honor mattered deeply to him, and the thought of shame tightened his chest like a rope. He believed a man must control his home or lose his name. He had been raised on hard lessons. As a boy, he was told, "A man does not bend. A man does not ask." Strength was praised, tears were mocked, and silence was mistaken for wisdom. Elders taught him how to stand tall in public, but never how to sit gently with his own emotions. These lessons hardened him, shaping his pride like clay baked too long in fire. His wife was the opposite of noise. She moved through the village with calm steps and lowered eyes, greeting elders with respect and children with kindness. Women admired her discipline, men respected her boundaries. She honored tradition, yet carried a quiet independence that needed no announcement. When troubles came, she spoke little, choosing patience over protest. "She is strong," an old woman once said softly, watching her sweep the compound. But no one knew the weight she carried in her silence, the sacrifices made without witness, the love she protected without applause. In the early days, their home had been filled with soft laughter and shared meals. They ate from the same bowl, spoke about tomorrow with hope, and rested at night with peace between them. But as seasons changed, burdens grew heavier. Money became tight like a rope pulled from both ends. Needs increased, prices rose, and the world outside their door began to press its ear against their marriage. Words between them slowly reduced. Where there had once been questions and comfort, there was now silence. Pride stood between them like a stubborn wall, refusing to let either heart bend first. At night, they lay side by side, facing the same roof but different thoughts. He wanted to speak but feared sounding weak. She wanted to explain but feared causing trouble. So both chose quiet, and quiet began to grow teeth. Then the small changes began. She returned home later than before, sometimes just as the sun dipped low. Her answers became shorter, her eyes often distant. When he asked casual questions, she smiled faintly and changed the subject. One evening, he noticed how quickly she turned her phone away. Another day, she stepped outside to take a call. None of these things were crimes, yet in his restless mind, they gathered like clouds. Ordinary actions became suspicious shadows. His curiosity woke slowly, like smoke rising before a fire is seen. The village did not help him sleep. At the well, women lowered their voices when he passed. Children giggled, repeating words they did not understand. A cousin leaned close one afternoon and said with a half-smile, "Brother, these days a man must watch his home carefully." A friend laughed and added, "Goats don't wander far without reason." Each word was small, but together they formed poison. Soon, the voices of others grew louder than the voice of his own heart. Instead of asking his wife, he asked his pride. Instead of seeking truth, he fed suspicion. "If I ask," he told himself, "she will lie." He refused patience, rejected wisdom, and closed his ears to counsel. In his mind, a man who questions looks foolish, but a man who controls looks strong. So he chose ego over understanding, standing at the crossroads of his marriage and walking the harder path without proof. One evening, an old man spoke softly near the fire, his eyes steady and knowing. "Remember," he said, tapping the ground with his stick, "a man who listens to whispers forgets the voice of his home." The words floated in the air like a warning bird. But the husband did not listen, and fate, patient as the earth, waited for the lesson to ripen. The shadow arrived slowly, like the first dark cloud over the horizon, unnoticed at first. In the quiet corners of his mind, the husband began to turn over small doubts. A smile that lingered too briefly, a step that paused too long, these little things gnawed at him. Trust, once sturdy and clear as a river in flood, now began to thin like morning mist. He said nothing, confronted nothing, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. He began to watch her. When she stepped outside to fetch water from the well, he lingered at the doorway, pretending to tend the garden. When she adjusted her cloth or spoke softly to a neighbor, he imagined secret meanings hidden in her gestures. Every ordinary action became a riddle to solve, every glance a possible betrayal. Observation replaced affection, and his mind refused the peace that once came naturally after a long day's work. A laugh shared with a child felt like a hidden joke against him. A sigh at sunset seemed like a confession. He turned love into evidence, and innocence into accusation. The simple warmth of her touch now whispered questions he feared to ask. Each imagined betrayal fed itself, like dry grass catching sparks from a careless fire. His heart judged before truth had even risen. At night, sleep became a stranger. Dreams carried warnings he could not understand, shadows moving between walls, familiar faces with strange eyes, footsteps where none should be. The wind against the window sounded like whispered secrets. He awoke with his heart pounding, the shadows still clinging, the silence around him filled with unspoken threats. The spirit seemed to warn him, but he refused to hear its voice, closing his eyes only to see fear. Cracked mirrors reflected not just faces, but the fracture in his heart. A calabash fell in the kitchen with a hollow thud, as if it carried an unspoken message. Tradition murmured its signs of imbalance, subtle and patient. Misfortune whispered through broken objects, unseen yet felt. He did not yet hear it, but the village itself seemed to lean closer, ready to teach him that what is ignored in the heart will soon speak loudly in the life outside. The men of the village gathered beneath the shade of the old baobab, their laughter rising like smoke from a fire. It was light, playful, or so it seemed. But for him, every chuckle carried a sting. "Be careful, brother," one said with a grin, "or your wife will have all the goats running to her before you know it." Another added, "A man who cannot guard his house must guard his pride instead." Each joke seemed small, yet they landed like sharp stones. He felt their eyes on him, weighing him, measuring his worth. Masculinity, once a quiet strength, became a fragile mask he feared to remove. Every movement in his home, every smile from his wife, became a test under the gaze of the village. Later, the elders approached, slow and deliberate, their feet stirring dust and tradition. "Remember," one said softly, tapping his staff, "a river that rises too quickly can flood the fields it nourishes." Another added, "Control yourself, for a man who chases shadows loses the light he already holds." The husband nodded, but the words fell like leaves in a dry well, heard, but without root. Pride had built walls around his ears, and ancestral wisdom could not reach him. At the next market gathering, whispers brushed past him like dry wind. A neighbor laughed lightly. "Did you see him yesterday? Watching the courtyard like a hawk." He felt the shame prick deeper than hunger. Reputation mattered more than love, more than comfort in his home. Community judgment reshaped his choices. Every step he took became a careful measure against public mockery. Every glance he cast at his wife was weighted with fear that others might see him fail. At home, she noticed the cold distance before it had a name. He sat at the edge of the hearth, silent, his eyes distant even when hers searched for warmth. She tilted her head, puzzled by the absence of conversation, the quiet that had replaced laughter. Her hands worked at the cooking, her movement steady, her heart heavy with questions that dared not rise. Love met silence, not words. Yet she did not strike, nor did she demand answers. She chose service, preparing meals with care, tending the home with diligence. She prayed softly in the evening, hands raised, asking protection for hearts that had grown wary. Household harmony became her shield, and her quiet strength held the walls of their home together, even as suspicion and pride eroded the space between them. Her silence was not surrender, it was endurance, a gentle armor against the slow poison creeping into their lives. She carried it quietly, the weight that no one saw. Each day, she rose before the sun, her hands moving through chores that seemed ordinary to everyone else, yet each motion bore the weight of unseen struggle. She balanced food, water, prayers, and worries, all while hiding the burden that pressed upon her chest. No one praised her courage. No one spoke of her sacrifices. She endured in silence, her loyalty a shield, her strength a quiet song only the spirits seemed to hear. The heart of a woman like hers was a fortress built without applause. Meanwhile, the husband turned his restless mind to justification. Each day, he convinced himself that suspicion was wisdom, that testing her loyalty was a path to truth. His thoughts became careful plans, careful schemes dressed in reason. In his mind, he was clever, careful, and right. He told himself, "If I do this, I protect my honor." And so, self-deception grew, cloaking cruelty as logic, whispering that control was better than understanding, that fear was a guide wiser than trust. He avoided her gaze, choosing hidden observations over open words. Questions were replaced by shadows, conversations by manipulations. He left notes where she could see nothing, watched when she thought he rested, measured each gesture as if it were a test. Love, once simple and tender, became a laboratory in which he tried her patience, her loyalty, her very soul. What had been affection now turned to experiments, and the warmth of their shared home cooled under the weight of his secret design. One morning, an elder came quietly to speak with him beneath the old mango tree. "Son," he said softly, "a man who builds walls between himself and the truth will one day walk alone." The husband nodded, but the words slid past him like water off leaves. He smiled, hiding his dismissal, and walked on. The warning, meant to save him, was ignored. Fate watched, patient and unhurried, noting the choice with quiet understanding. Even the smallest voices began to speak. His young niece, chasing a rolling calabash, looked up and said, "Uncle, the tree by the river is crying. Why do its leaves fall so early?" He laughed lightly, dismissing it as a child's fancy. Yet the words clung to his mind, as if innocence itself had delivered a warning. Outside, the well was dry, the birds silent, and the earth beneath his feet seemed tired and restless. The world itself whispered signs of imbalance, of danger ahead, and he walked blindly toward the lesson it had already prepared. He moved silently through the house as though it belonged to someone else. Every step was measured, every word he might have spoken was replaced with a plan in his mind. Trust, once the gentle foundation of their life, was abandoned completely. In its place, his heart had grown cold and precise. He rehearsed actions in his mind as if arranging stones along a path, thinking each would reveal what he believed hidden. Every glance, every gesture of his wife became a part of the trap he was setting, and his emotions no longer guided him, they obeyed strategy. He followed her movements like a shadow behind a shadow. When she walked to the well, he lingered near the doorway, pretending to sharpen a knife while his eyes measured her steps. When she spoke softly to a neighbor, he imagined secrets folded within her words. Spying replaced partnership, and every act of care was twisted into suspicion. Manipulation became his tool, quiet and cunning, a weapon he thought necessary to defend honor. The warmth of love was gone, replaced by a cold calculation that made even his own hands tremble. Yet in the silence, the world whispered truths he refused to hear. The earth seemed uneasy, the wind stirring dust where it had not moved before. An old proverb echoed in the recesses of memory, "A man who listens to whispers forgets the voice of his home." He knew it once, but pride had buried it under layers of justification. Lying to uncover lies had become his guiding principle, and destiny had begun to tighten its grip, bending the path beneath his feet. The plan, once so perfect in his mind, began to wobble with the first signs of life outside his control. A calabash tumbled from the shelf. A child's laugh rang too close to the truth. Shadows moved differently than he expected. The trap he had carefully laid began to spring, not on her, but on him. The careful path of suspicion spiraled into chaos. Every step he had planned led him toward confusion and exposure, and the house that once held warmth now trembled with the consequences of a heart that had hunted truth with lies. By nightfall, he stood alone, the silence heavy around him. What he sought had escaped, leaving only fear and regret in its place. His trap had caught nothing but himself. And in the quiet, the proverb spoke again, louder now than ever. When a man hunts truth with lies, he returns empty-handed. He returned home that evening, his mind still tight with suspicion. From the doorway, he saw her speaking with a man in the courtyard. Their hands brushed over a basket of yams, and a laugh escaped her lips. His chest tightened, and the world narrowed to the space between them. Pride whispered, "Look what she hides from you." Fear painted the moment darker than it was, and in that instant, truth was lost. What he saw through wounded eyes became a story of betrayal, one that would guide his hand before he sought clarity. Misunderstanding had taken root, strong and bitter. Voices came quickly after. A neighbor peered over the fence. A cousin arrived with hurried steps. Family members gathered near, curiosity shining in their eyes. What had once been private was now a spectacle. No one spoke at first, yet the weight of watching eyes made silence impossible. The courtyard, the walls, even the dust beneath their feet carried witnesses. In that moment, the husband realized that secrecy had fled, leaving every heartbeat exposed to judgment. By mid-morning, the elders were called. They arrived with slow, deliberate steps, staffs tapping the hard earth. Their eyes were calm but piercing. Tradition demanded that no deed, no matter how hidden, escape account. The husband's story was told in fragments, and the elders listened, their expressions neutral but heavy with knowing. Judgment did not come in shouts or violence, but in measured words and patient observation. The truth, like water, found the cracks of deceit and seeped through, revealing the foundations of every action. When he faced the circle of elders, his deeds could no longer hide behind fear or pride. They observed him as he had observed others, weighing each choice, each hesitation. Respect, once easily given by neighbors and friends, began to slip from his hands like sand through fingers. Dishonor clung to him now, not to his wife. Murmurs rose quietly among the assembly, confirming what the quietest heart had already known. Suspicion had led him astray. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm but strong. "I sought only to care for my family," she said. "I carried burdens so that the house could stand, so that the children would not go hungry. My silence was not betrayal but protection." Her actions, revealed in that moment, shone with sacrifice. Loyalty stood firm, unbroken by fear, accusation, or misunderstanding. The elders nodded slowly, and the husband felt the weight of their wisdom settle over him. Her hidden struggles, unseen for so long, now spoke loudly, demanding recognition. He understood, at last, that love had never left his home. It had only been disguised in quiet work, prayer, and endurance. Her suffering now had a voice, and with it came the painful lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. The courtyard, once a stage for suspicion, became a place of understanding. Neighbors and family watched as the truth unfolded. The wife's burden had been for the sake of all, her strength proven in silence, her loyalty unshaken. The man, humbled, bowed his head, feeling the weight of his own folly. The lesson was clear, and the spirits of the ancestors, patient as always, seemed to sigh in approval. She stepped forward, her shoulders straight, her hands folded calmly in front of her. The courtyard fell silent as she spoke, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a voice steady and true. "I have done nothing to betray this home," she said. "Everything I have done, every step I have taken, has been for our family. My silence was not defiance, it was protection. I worked, I prayed, I endured, so that our children would not go hungry and so that this house could remain whole." Her words carried weight, not in volume, but in the honesty they held. She did not shout, she did not demand vindication. Her dignity became her shield, wrapping her in a quiet authority that none could question. Even the neighbors, who had gathered in hushed curiosity, felt the gravity of her speech. Murmurs of doubt and suspicion faltered in the face of her composed honesty. Each word, deliberate and unwavering, cut deeper than any raised voice could. False pride faltered under the power of truth spoken softly, and the emotional tension that had hung over the household like a storm cloud now found its center. The elders leaned on their staffs, their eyes narrowing with thought. One spoke slowly, his voice carrying the rhythm of proverbs that had guided the village for generations. "A man who hunts shadows with fire forgets the warmth of the hearth," he intoned. Another added, "The tree that bends to the wind does not break, the one that resists falls first." The crowd absorbed these words, each proverb a blade of wisdom, sharper than any weapon, cutting through pretense and pride. Above them, the sky seemed to respond. Clouds gathered and broke, sending gentle rain over the courtyard, washing dust from the paths and the hearts of those who watched. A soft wind rustled through the trees, as if even nature was sighing in acknowledgment of balance restored. Fate, patient and impartial, had noted justice done. No one struck a hand. No one raised a fist. The punishment was not in pain but in shame. The husband's arrogance and distrust had placed him in a quiet circle of judgment that could not be escaped. Truth stood triumphant, and all who bore witness understood the lesson. Justice does not always need violence to declare its victory. He lowered his eyes, seeing himself clearly for the first time. The jealousy that had clouded his vision was laid bare, raw and unmasked. Pride, he realized, had been the true enemy, building walls between him and the woman he loved. His heart trembled with the weight of recognition. For the first time, he understood the folly of listening to whispers instead of the voice of home, and the cost of letting fear and suspicion govern the heart. Around him, life continued. The children played, the neighbors whispered quietly, and the rain fell steadily, carrying with it the cleansing of dishonor and the silent promise of new understanding. The night stretched long after the events of yesterday, but it offered no comfort. Regret weighed heavily on the husband's shoulders, pressing against his chest with the same relentlessness as the mid-afternoon sun. He had acted on fear, on pride, on whispers that were never truths. Now, in the quiet, he felt the full measure of his foolishness. The faces of those who had watched him, the disapproving silence of the elders, the knowing eyes of neighbors, all pressed into him, reminding him that consequences do not bend for desire or explanation. The lesson came as sharply as the edge of a sharpened knife. Pain had arrived to teach, not to destroy. The home had not burned to ashes, but the fire of truth had scorched the illusions he held. Every misstep, every suspicion, every action taken without care now lay before him. He understood what was lost, and what could never be fully regained. The moment was cruel, yet precise. Wisdom had arrived on the wings of suffering. Morning came slowly, brushing the mud-brick walls with pale light. Silence hung heavy over the house, deeper than the roar of any argument. The wife moved quietly through the rooms, tending to the children, her eyes soft but wary. Love had not vanished, but trust lay wounded, fragile as a clay pot teetering on the edge of a shelf. The home felt different, every corner holding memory and caution, every sound measured. Even the birds outside seemed to pause, as though aware that the air itself had shifted. The marriage continued, yet the warmth that had once wrapped them in quiet unity had been replaced by distance. Shared meals and laughter remained, but the innocence of before had dissolved into a careful rhythm of conversation and silence. Memories of joy now carried the sting of what had passed. They were together, yet the bond had altered. The house stood intact, yet the heart of it bore the marks of fire. Among neighbors, life carried on, but he felt the absence of their ease like a shadow. People greeted him with a tilt of the head rather than a smile. The greetings he once took for granted now felt hollow, as though each word reminded him of the respect he had forfeited. He stood among many, yet found himself entirely alone in the shame he had created. Pride, once armor, had melted in the heat of his mistakes, leaving only self-awareness and regret to fill the space where confidence had lived. The village spoke not with shouting or judgment, but with quiet withdrawal. Eyes that once lingered in friendly curiosity now averted, neighbors who once laughed with him now moved past without pause. Social honor, a treasure he had guarded above all else, had slipped silently through his fingers. Without a word, without confrontation, the community had delivered its verdict. He understood now that some lessons do not need force to be felt, they live in the calm, persistent hush of disapproval. The husband lowered his head, feeling the weight of his own folly, and the wind outside carried a soft, hollow whisper through the trees, as if the earth itself reminded him, wisdom comes too late for the unheeding heart, and the voice of truth often waits patiently until it can be heard. The husband sat alone in the dim light of the early morning, the weight of his actions pressing upon him heavier than any blow or insult could. His body had returned home from the village, but his spirit felt stranded, shackled by guilt. No one had struck him, no stone had landed, yet he felt the sharpness of punishment in every quiet corner of his mind. Each memory of suspicion, each imagined betrayal, pressed into his chest with a relentless insistence. He whispered to himself, "I have built my own chains, and I am the prisoner." The path to the elder's hut seemed longer than it had ever been, each step echoing in the stillness of the village. When he arrived, he bowed low, his head almost touching the dirt, a gesture of humility that spoke louder than words. The elder's eyes regarded him, not with malice, but with the unflinching gaze of wisdom. One of them spoke softly, "A man who has wandered into fire must learn to feel its warmth before seeking water." His voice was calm but carried the weight of generations, and the husband nodded, accepting that guidance without question. Inside himself, he began to reckon with the truth he had long evaded. Denial fell away like dry leaves, and reflection replaced it. He admitted the foolishness, the pride, the blindness that had led him here. Slowly, a small warmth of understanding grew. He could not undo what was done, but he could learn, forgive, and carry that lesson forward. He whispered, "I must forgive myself before I ask others to forgive me." The thought was bitter, but necessary. Later, he approached his wife. There was no defensiveness in his posture, no insistence on authority or justification. He knelt briefly, hands trembling, and spoke quietly, "I was blind, and I hurt you. I ask for forgiveness, not because I deserve it, but because my heart knows it's wrong." Her eyes were steady, calm, reflecting neither rage nor relief, only a quiet measure of strength. She nodded once, imperceptibly, showing that she had seen his remorse and chosen her own path. She rose without bitterness, her dignity intact. There were no words of revenge, no bitter echoes to haunt him. She moved with the grace of someone who had endured quietly, who had chosen moral clarity over anger. The balance of their home shifted slightly that day, not erased, not perfect, but restored in the quiet understanding that strength often lives in restraint, and that forgiveness, though given gently, is the most powerful act of all. The husband knelt quietly, the dust of the village floor settling around him like the weight of his own shame. He had spoken his truth, laid bare his mistakes, and yet forgiveness did not come at once. His wife looked at him with eyes that measured time and patience, not anger. She reached slowly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I forgive you," she whispered, "but my heart must remember, and my trust must grow like the river after the first rains. We walk together, but the path will take time to mend." The proverb he had ignored for so long now echoed in his mind, heavy and unyielding, "A man who tests gold with fire must accept the burns." He felt it sting, not as punishment, but as wisdom carved into the bones of his understanding. Pain had been the teacher, and truth the unrelenting lesson. In the village, whispers shifted into thoughtful silence. Mothers reminded children, friends nodded to one another, and elders spoke softly to the youth of patience and listening. The story of pride, suspicion, and humility became woven into the fabric of the community. They learned that trust, once fractured, demands care, that listening is a gift, and that pride can destroy what love builds. The morning light broke over the repaired home, glinting off the newly planted tree in the yard, a symbol of renewal, quiet but deliberate. The husband walked slowly through the village path, alone, yet no longer burdened by the weight of secrecy. His steps were careful, cautious, but hopeful, for he carried wisdom earned through fire. Life would continue, love would endure, but the lessons remained like the deep roots of the tree, permanent, solemn, and necessary.